I'm really looking forward to tonight's conversation. I've interviewed Elaine a few times over the years in my broadcasting career, but this will be a real treat getting to know her in a bit more depth, her story, and also taking your questions. So I do encourage you, as Sam said, to either write your questions on the forms or to use the Slido app and to get the questions in. But first of all, I'm going to sit down with Elaine. So please do give another warm round of applause to Elaine Storkey. Elaine, thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
We will find out all about your early life, influences and your Christian faith in a moment, but what does a normal day look like for Elaine Storkey?
There is no such thing as a normal day, I'm afraid. Sometimes I pray and long for normal days. The only thing that's normal about my day is that if I'm at home, my husband brings me porridge to bed.
Oh, that's very good.
And the porridge is gorgeous. It's made with oats, of course, and then currants and bananas and fruit and all kinds of things. After that, he disappears into his own study, and, and then I face the day. So every day is different. It involves lots of communication, sometimes travel, sometimes learning and research, an awful lot of time just answering people's questions and emails and stuff like that. Umpteen things. Making marmalade this week was great.
Well, good.
Enough for the whole year.
Well, we all need to make a bit of time for making marmalade in our lives. I guess I find it, you know, there's all kinds of titles I could give to you, Elaine. You're an academic, you're a philosopher, you're a sociologist, you're a public theologian, you're an author, a broadcaster. But where did it all begin for you? What was the sort of the Christian influences, as it were, growing up? And were there any of those sort of aspects of theology, philosophy sort of nascent when you were sort of a child as well?
Yes, I suppose looking back, it started at a very young age, as they say. I was born at the end of the Second World War. My father was still away in the Navy. He didn't come home until nearly the 1950s. So I was brought up by my mother and her sisters and my grandmother in a kind of woman's enclave for the first few years. And I think, looking back on it, I always wanted to know why. In fact, I think I bored my relatives silly by always asking why this, why something else. And for me, it seemed very, very important to know why. And I think that's kind of undergirded my academic pursuits all my life, really. My mummy was an Anglo-Catholic and occasionally took me along to a very, very Anglo-Catholic church, which was drenched in prayer and nuns and things. And I kind of loved that. And I believed in God from as long as I could remember. I remember on Good Friday climbing onto the roof of a little coal house we had outside our house and just thinking about Jesus on the cross. I think I might have been 7 or 8 at the time. And then just spending that next hour praying to God, completely unaware of the fact that my parents were hunting everywhere for me and had never thought to look outside on the coal shed. And were getting really quite worried and almost called the police before the dog barked and alerted them to where I was. So I had a God consciousness from a very, very early age. My paternal grandmother was a Salvation Army lady, although she was also very, very raw and really quite vulgar in her attitudes to life. So she gave me mixed kind of messages throughout my childhood. But yes, I think God was always a part of my life, even as a youngster.
And did that simply carry on? Was it just a continuing, gradual dawning awareness? Or
No, at the age of 16, I think I heard the gospel for the first time, the real gospel, apart from all the kind of stuff that you get in church that you absorb, with clarity, that it was actually about God being not just the supreme ruler and creator of the entire universe, but about having a relationship with God that didn't have anything in the way. And I suddenly realized there were lots of things in the way of my relationship with God. And those things were my bad behavior, my bad attitudes, and my thoughts, and my unkindness, and all sorts of things, which I then began to recognize as sin. So I think recognizing, hearing the gospel, that we're all carrying baggage around, And at the age of 16, I could identify a lot of baggage, much of which we would need to bring to God in an attitude of repentance and ask your forgiveness. And I think doing that, I suddenly had a different experience of God. And that was God's sacrificial love for me. The whole meaning of the cross and Jesus' death started to take a much greater priority in my thinking. So I really talk about my Christian conversion at the age of 16, but of course I was a Christian long before that, in embryo, as it were. And then it nearly all went when I was 18 and a half, 19.
Oh, right. What happened?
At university. I went to university to study philosophy because I thought, what would be the most difficult thing for a Christian to do? Let's kind of throw myself in the deep end. Very cocky, quite naive. And I went to university, and one of the members of the staff, one of the professors, loved feeding Christians to the lions. I mean,
I was going to say, was it Elaine in the Lions?
It was a whole sport for him, and he just decided I was his target for the year, and just ploughed into me week after week. And I mean, at the same time, my favourite aunt died at the age of 32, which was a terrible shock. And then other people that I knew died, and prayers were not being answered, and I just went under, completely under, and into a place where I just didn't believe, didn't know whether anything was real. And I looked back on it afterwards, and it was like looking down into an abyss, and there was nothing there except abyss. Knocking on the door of the universe, I think Francis Schaeffer once says, and there's nobody home. And I knew what that felt like. I knew what it felt like to have that total existential doubt. And for me, it was God or nothing. God or nothing. If it's not God, there's nothing. And the idea that we might be living in a world where there was nothing was terrifying. And I think I went through something akin to a very deep spiritual kind of trauma during that period. What brought me out of it is very interesting, because the dear CU girls that I was living with would tuck me into bed every night and say platitudes, you'll be all right, darling, oh, go home, go away, just put the light off. In a sense, I was impatient with them because they couldn't begin to understand. And I was really unfair and unkind to them, but they had a lot of platitudes. And one night, one of the girls tucking me in said, I really do believe that you're going to understand the answer to your questions, and God's going to be here for you. And I said, thank you. Put the light out as you leave. And she didn't. And I shouted, please put the light out before you go. And then I looked up and she wasn't there, and the light was out, but it wasn't out. And there was this sense in the room of light. Not lights like we're seeing now, but light. And it was light in weight as well. And I didn't know anything, but I slept that night. And it's the first time I'd slept for weeks and weeks, months. And the next morning I got up and I felt a different person, really refreshed, as if I'd come out of something horrid. I went back to lectures. I hadn't been going to lectures for the last month. And the first lecture was this guy who was feeding me to the lions. And I sat there and I listened to all his assumptions. I listened to the way he was thinking, what presuppositions he was making. And I thought, how could I ever have been taken in by this guy? And it was a different kind of ball game from then onwards. I felt as if I'd been exposed. I'd suffered what other people who doubt suffer. But really, I now saw where this man was coming from. And he was in a terrible place. He was making assumptions about all kinds of stuff, feeding it into the arguments, and then tripping people up. And it was a kind of game for him. Right. And from then, I don't think my faith has wavered in the same way at all. I mean, that doesn't mean to say that one never has doubts. That's not true. But it's been a very different situation. And I'm grateful for that experience.
Yeah. Gosh, what an interesting story. And in a way, an example of the way in which the Christian faith is never straightforward. It often goes on in bumps and go round corners and over hills. But it's great to know that in a sense, there was that catalyst, if you like, these important moments, hearing the gospel, but then obviously this special moment that I guess you would say God gave you. Was that the way you needed to sort of be reassured? Because not everyone will have such an experience, I suppose, will they?
I think it was important for me, for my life's work, because it's given me not just an understanding of people who are struggling with doubt and have no meaning in their life, but an enormous compassion for them. I mean, I weep with them. I feel broken up by them, and I just want more than anything for them to come to know God who loves them and Jesus who died for them. So I think it was important to have that sense so that I could actually be enabled to detect it in other people and be able to reach out in empathy.
Yeah. I mean, at an academic level, you continued to pursue philosophy, didn't you?
Indeed.
So tell us a bit about that. And I suppose what it was like as well, I assume in an era when there were far less women in academia at the time.
Yes, I was the only academic woman in my department. And then I went to Canada to do a master's degree, came back to do a doctorate at York. And again, I was the only research student there. And then it was quite interesting because John Mackey, who was the professor at York, was probably one of the country's two famous atheists.
Yes, a very famous atheist philosopher.
Indeed, and I debated with him in front of the entire kind of university, because it was a small university in those days. And it was very, very interesting, and he was a very gracious man, a very kind and loving man, and that's where I learnt another lesson, very important lesson, because the night of our debate, his wife was very ill, and he was unsure about doing this debate, but came anyway because it was on the programme, and he had a very strong sense of duty, and his arguments were not very good. And actually, I took him to the cleaners. I was savage with him. I really went for the jugular. I just annihilated so much of what he had to say. And the crowd loved it. They were on my side. Even the atheists were on my side. They loved this, you know. And I went home feeling euphoric, you know. It was clear that a Christian had beaten an atheist in this argument in York University. And the next morning, I went into my office, because they gave me an office in those days, and Mackie was coming along the corridor, and he said, good morning, Miss Lively. Lively was my maiden name. You did very well last night. He said, you played to the crowds, you won their hearts, and you lost a good friend, he said. And then disappeared into his office. And I thought, oh my goodness, I did. I was so unfair to the man. You know, I wasn't kind or compassionate or anything. I was determined to win. Just wanted to win. And I felt this small because of the way I'd handled that debate. And later apologized, and we continued being good friends. Right. But that really, again, was a good lesson. Yes. You don't annihilate somebody in argument. Yes. You always give them some respect and some space to move.
So you learned it the hard way in that sense.
Well, I mean, I was grateful for him to say that. You know, you lost a good friend. I mean, first of all, I hadn't realized he was a good friend.
I mean, you obviously were pursuing a successful academic career in philosophy. Eventually, though, that sort of broadened out into, I know, sociology, theology, and so on. What were some of the things that started to take your interest? And what it should be said that you started to really broadcast this in all kinds of other ways. You didn't keep it in the ivory towers of academia. You, over your life, you've been involved in broadcasting, lots of public speaking, heading up international work, and all sorts of things. So tell us sort of where the journey took you as you progressed.
Well, I went into sociology because I married my husband, my darling Alan, and he was a sociologist up at Stirling University. So I had to leave Oxford, where I was then, and go to Stirling. And they had too many philosophers in Stirling. They had more philosophers than they had students. But they had very few sociologists. So I switched department, knowing absolutely zilch about sociology. And they decided if I knew, if I was that bright in philosophy, surely I could do sociology. And the nights before the seminar, Alan would coach me. This is the curriculum, this is what they'll say, this is your answer. And that's how I learned sociology. Ridiculous, really. But I was a research fellow, so I did a study on policemen's families, which was riveting. It meant I went to visit policemen and their wives and their children in Stirling and Clackmannan and in Glasgow. My project was to find out why they were leaving the police force in the droves in which they were. Well, you really didn't need a research sociologist to tell you that, but the reason they were leaving them in Glasgow is because of the gang warfare and the fact that they were targets and their families were targets, and no kind of police pastoral provision was helping them at all. And so it went on. So I got very, very involved in sociology and found it a very interesting area because it's about social relationships, it's about people in groups, it's about lives, it's about families, it's about deviance, it's about a whole range of things that are going on in social and community life, and I'm tremendously involved in that. But yes, because we came out of university teaching quite quickly and went into other areas of life, although always staying in university teaching, I'm a member of Newnham College in Cambridge right now, so I've never been very far from the university. But there's a big world out there, you know, and what you're learning in academia has to have some kind of purchase in real life outside academia. And I found the things outside academia became more and more interesting and needed to get involved in those.
I suppose sociology itself is obviously a subject which makes you look at the world a slightly different way, get under the skin of what's going on in our culture and society. And to that extent, I imagine you started to see overlap with theology, with the gospel, with what the Christian story can offer as well.
Well, it wasn't so much as an overlap, but as a Christian, I just wanted to see everything Christianly. And this had been Alan's mission and my mission, really from the time we first met. We were trying to think thoughts Christian. We were trying to have a Christian worldview in the subject areas that we're studying. And we just believe that there's no such thing as neutrality in education. Everybody comes to education with assumptions, presuppositions, value systems, and so on. And the sociologists I was working with all had these value systems, but they didn't realize they were value systems. As far as they were concerned, this was normal. But normalization is just taking your value system and then developing it in such a way that everybody agrees with it. But it's still a value system. So I think what we were trying to do was see the world through Christian eyes, see sociology and social relationships, family relationships and so on, through Christian eyes, and see how we could help sociologists to see the importance of understanding the subject from a Christian point of view. Unlike the natural sciences that grew in a period where Christianity was still very central and important in our culture, the social sciences didn't. They were post-Enlightenment. So already we'd shifted the worldview from having God as part of the agenda to being focused on the human person, the sovereignty of the human individual, and all of that. That's already started. And so sociology got off to a bad start, and we really need to pull it back and help it along the way.
I mean, in many ways, I think of you as a public theologian, in the sense that you're speaking to a wide audience about a whole variety of different subjects, as you say, with the Christian worldview sort of front and centre in all of it. What have been some of the highlights over the years of the different audiences you've been able to reach and the different places you've been able to speak and to bring your message and thinking?
Gosh, we'd be here for the next 4 days if I started to... there were so many. I love broadcasting and still do. I still do regular broadcasting with BBC Radio Ulster. I'm their theologian in residence.
Right.
And people have always regarded me as a theologian, and I've got a DD, which they tell me is a doctorate of divinity, so I am a theologian. But what I think I've really enjoyed is just helping people to see what they're seeing and disturb them, so that it's just no longer normal to think the way they think, and there are other ways of seeing things, and God might really have some say in that and some part of the picture. So I found that a great deal when I was doing Thought for the Day on BBC Radio and a lot of other organisations and a lot of other programmes. And I loved the people I met in those contexts, and it'd be very, very interesting at the end of a Thought for the Day where you'd done something that had struck the other people in the studio, because in those days we didn't do it online, it was all in the studio. And then you'd go and have breakfast with them, and they'd talk about it, and it could be anybody. It could be a leading trade unionist, a politician, anybody. And suddenly they were open to discussing why you as a Christian wanted to come and do this, and what that had to say in their lives. Another thing was, I was up in Scotland. I loved this. I was carted up there by a fellow academic in Salford University who is now running the Kiel Centre, and this was for middle management businesses. And he said, come up and teach a course on teaching business with integrity, working with integrity, and do something on Christian ethics. And I said, but I've never done it with business people before. He said, oh yeah, you like it, you'll really enjoy it. Well, I was so out of my depth. You know, this is a very hardcore business environment. And in this particular gathering, there were top businessmen, people who ran huge businesses in Scotland, coming to see whether they wanted to send their middle management to this course. And I was a taster. So imagine that. And I was really out of my depth and praying all the time that, please Lord, let what I'm saying be relevant in some way or another. Let it meet these people. And we got on well. There were about 25 in this group. One guy said nothing all the way through the morning, absolutely nothing. And he looked a bit hostile at the beginning and then just very bored and all the rest of it. When it came to lunch, she came over to me and said, I'd like to buy you a whiskey. Well, I don't drink whiskey. I mean, I can't stand the taste of whiskey. I mean, and I thought, I was about to say no thank you. And a voice inside me said, take this man's whiskey. So I said, that's very kind of you. I'd be delighted to have whiskey. So he took me to the bar and bought me this very large whiskey, handed it over, and I sipped it, and it didn't taste too bad, so I carried on sipping it. And I said, so why are you giving me this great encouragement? This was the guy who had said nothing all morning. So he said, well, I'll tell you a reason why. He said, when they said they wanted to send my middle management to this course, would I come and listen to this woman? I said, yes, sure, I'd come. And I'd signed up, he said, before I realized that it was a woman, a Christian woman, who was going to come and talk about working with integrity. And he said, I thought, oh my God, she'll go on and on about temperance. And you haven't mentioned temperance once, he said. So I said, well, why would that matter to you? He said, because I'm the head of Allied Distilleries.
That's great.
And then he went on to say, but do you know what? Almost everything you've said this morning, I agree with. I agree with those ethics, but I'm not a believer. So there's something that's wrong. Either you're right as a believer and I'm wrong as an unbeliever, and I think we need to discuss this. Wow. And it really opened the door to something really spectacular.
Wow. That's such a great story. One of the things that you have been quite well known for is your engagement with feminism. In fact, I think probably you were certainly the first person from an evangelical perspective really to write seriously on it. I think probably your first book on it was nearly 40 years ago.
Long time ago.
What led you into that? And I suppose how has feminism, you could define what you think it is, but how it's changed in all those years that you've been following the movement? What
led me into it was we were in the 60s, there was a third wave feminist thing that I was studying in sociology. By this time I was married, we had children. I just had my third child, I think, by then, or maybe just a second child. And so I wanted to keep my brain ticking over, and I went to the local further education college and offered my services to teach A-level sociology. And that's how it started. And I was studying feminist wave movements and so on, and teaching them in sociology. And I suddenly realized that the people who I was teaching were in fact the people that were represented in this study itself. So I was talking to miners' wives and plumbers' wives and a whole range of people who mostly stay-at-home women who hadn't had much education. And they fitted the description of what the feminists were all on about, you know, that their life's chances, their limitations, the discrimination against them and all the rest of it. I found that very interesting. And I thought, well, if only I could introduce them to the church and the gospel, you know, that would be half the problem solved. And it was when I started to do this, I realized that actually it's not, because the church also has the problem of what to do with women. And so it started me on a really important journey, is to try to understand more about what the biblical teaching about men and women in relationship and gender and society was, but also to reach out to women specifically. Up to that point, I'd lived in a very male world, but now I had children. Now I was doing what other women did. And I used to go along to some of my friends in workshop and say, excuse me for asking, but what do you do all day? Because I was now a stay-at-home mum, apart from this night class I did. And they say, what do you mean, what do we do all day? We do the washing up, we look after the kids, you know. But I've done all that this morning and I've still got time. You can't have done it. It takes a whole day to do these things. And it just occurred to me that it was actually very, very interesting trying to work with women who hadn't had my privileged background and my academic background. So teaching them at college was a great blessing. I loved it. And we got on really like a house on fire.
Well, when it comes to the issue of women, especially in church leadership, now that's been a thorny issue for a long time in the church. Where did that study take you, and what would you say is or is not in any way the kind of roles that women can inhabit in the church from your perspective?
I think it came in different stages for me. So I was quite clear that women could do whatever they were talented to do, whatever gifts God had given them should be used. It's not that they could if they had to use them, because otherwise it's a waste of talent. My talent was communication and teaching, so I had to be a teacher. I tended to teach people who were further on in education, so that was a fit for me, and that was straightforward. But what about women whose ministries or whose talents were in a church-related setting? Surely those doors should be open to them too. So for me, it didn't seem to make any sense at all to deny women the possibility of using the gifts that God had given them for those specific purposes because they were women. I mean, come on, what is all that about? But I hadn't, at that stage, moved into any kind of preaching ministry. I preach an awful lot now, I have done for donkey's years. And that changed when I went to teach in a theological college with my husband. We shared a job because we had children, so we shared one job in sociology. And the principal of the college put me down on the preaching rota, which kind of scared me. I looked at this and I mean, it was a very, very conservative college where women never preached. In fact, women weren't even on the staff. So I was there as a woman and I was preaching. So I went along to the principal and said, I'm not sure about this. I've always read the scriptures that women ought to be preaching in public. Where did you read that, he said. So I took him to the relevant passages. Of course, he knew all about this. I said, isn't it something to do with headship? He said, oh, the headship. Well, if you think about headship, he said, I'm the head of this institution. I've just put you down, you're preaching. So that was him resolving it. He was a lovely, wonderful, gracious man and a very, very conservative theologian. So I preached and suddenly found it was me. I really, really loved getting into the scriptures and hearing God's voice in the scriptures and bringing them alive and then communicating that through the Holy Spirit to other people. And I just know that there was never any doubt in me that God had given me this talent and therefore I had to use it. Then should I go into ordained ministry? No, because my ministry was always as a layperson. But it meant that I wanted to throw myself into supporting those women who had similar kinds of gifting from God and needed and felt drawn to the ordained ministry. So that's how that started, really.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, perhaps we'll have some time in the Q&A section to draw that out a little more, because there's all kinds of theological questions that might be bubbling away in those who were watching. But there are so many things we could talk about this evening in terms of the work that you've done, Elaine, but a major sort of piece of research and writing that you did in recent years was the book Scars Across Humanity. And this is really about gender-based violence, and you really look at it in all kinds of different ways. So what sort of inspired that particular work? And I suppose, what does the Christian gospel have to say to such a huge global issue?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question, Justin. I came across, I suppose, this, having been brought up by very loving parents where I never saw any kind of domestic violence and was completely foreign to it. When we were married, I had children, the editor of a woman's magazine, a Christian woman's magazine, wrote to me and said, I've just put out a questionnaire because I think I want to get to the root of domestic violence. That's what we called it then. We call it intimate partner violence now. And I've got about 200 answers in this questionnaire. Do you mind looking at it and then writing a report, collating it together as a sociologist? I said, sure, just bung it in the post. came in the post. Late one night, I opened it, thought I'd better get into this. Started reading these answers on the questionnaire. My heart sank. Just page after page after page after page of women detailing their lives as victims of domestic violence. It was horrendous. And a lot of these were in the church. Some of them were even married to church leaders. And it was a horrendous shock. I was already probably in my 30s, and I'd not come across this. It was such a shock. But that was very important. I wrote the report, and we went ahead and did a big campaign on it in this magazine. But then I suppose my antennae were out. I was now sensitive to this, and I started to see so much more. And not just domestic violence, but also rape and incest and a whole range of things. I became part of a group called Safety Net, which worked Christianly with survivors of incest, and I was a member of that for 10 years. And wherever I travelled, I saw more and more of it. As president of Tear Fund, that I was for 18 years, I was going abroad a lot. And this became, again, a very big platform, because in some patriarchal countries, it's quite normalized that women are beaten by their partners and so on. And domestic violence is very, very high. Acid attacks are very frequent in many parts of the world. And it's horrendous, horrendous. And it was when I went to Congo where I suddenly encountered rape as a weapon of war, because it's cheaper than bullets, it's more effective, that I suddenly thought, I've got to do something about this. I can't just carry on seeing it, absorbing it, I've got to write it. So that's when I started writing the book, which took me years and years to write because it was so difficult. And it's a huge scourge. So I think the Christian church needs to do something about this. We can't carry on ignoring it, especially when it's in our presence. Alan and I are both partners in terms of being ambassadors for an organization called Restored, which reaches out to the Christian church to men and women who are in this situation and offers them resources. But I think there are so many areas of domestic violence in the world. The intimate partner violence is just one of them. So what I do in the book is take the idea of a global woman, wherein the life cycle of a global woman is violence likely to occur, and the answer is all the way through. And it starts in the womb with sex-selective abortion, which you find all across India, part of China, although less so in China now, because families want boys, they don't want girls. And if you go to India a lot and see the celebration at the birth of a boy child and the quiet kind of sorrow, the birth of a girl child, it's writ large on it. So of course they abort the girls before they get to that stage. And it's also attached to the dowry and the whole economics of family life in India and so on. Layers and layers of this stuff. There are always cultural reasons. There are cultural reasons for female genital mutilation. And I saw that right across Africa in 28 countries. But it's barbaric. It's got no medical benefits whatsoever. Absolutely barbaric assault on a woman's body. Simply kind of cutting away her genitalia so she can't enjoy sexual intercourse and then stitching her up so that the only time that she's unstitched is when a bridegroom cuts her open on his wedding night. I mean, horrendous stuff. And for me, it just seemed appalling that we're not doing more that we should be doing. Since I wrote the book, organizations across the country have taken this up, and in some areas of the country, they're working with the Muslim women in that area to try and stamp out FGM. And in other areas, they're working with people on honor killings, because that's going on in our own country as well. And then, of course, there's rape, there's sexual kind of transporting people and trafficking, and there's prostitution. And I've got tremendously involved in Christian outreach in the whole area of prostitution over the last few years. And there's a massive work to be done there. There are now hundreds and hundreds, probably getting over 1,000 women in Christian churches in the UK who are working with local prostitutes. It's the most amazing form of outreach, and it's probably one of the most demanding form of outreach too. But it's really wonderful that things are happening, but so much more needs to happen.
I mean, as you said, given that some of the responses that first triggered this interest had come from people within the church, it's not that this doesn't happen within the church, obviously, but what have you found to be a ray of hope, if you like, in terms of what the Christian story offers, and I suppose in the way Jesus spoke and treated women and that sort of thing in this context?
I find the ray of hope is when men stand up and say, not in my name, not on my watch, not in my patch. And I found that, and this surprised me, that some of my most fervent supporters of when I wrote Scars Across Humanity have been young men. So I've been asked all over the country. I was invited up to Shropshire to speak to all the schools in the Shropshire area by this young deputy headmaster, Christian, who invited me to his school and then got me involved in a lot of other schools just to talk about violence against women. And he's passionate about it. He's got daughters. He doesn't want things to happen to them. So I think when Christian men and women partner together on this, and when Christian men who have these problems of abuse, and when Christian women do too, because it does happen the other way, sadly, it's not anything like as accentuated, and it's far less likely to end in death, because the number of women killed by their partners or former partners every year is growing, sadly, in this country. But when I see Christians working with that, then it's such a wonderful kind of encouragement. And it's an encouragement to the women who have been victimized. I've got a friend, a colleague, a woman called Karen Mingala-Smith, who has this webpage called Counting Dead Women. Look at it when you get a chance. She writes the obituaries of women who've been killed this month. She keeps a roll call going. She's an agnostic. She doesn't think much to Christianity. She thinks even less of the church. She thinks we're wet, pretty useless. But we've become friends. We know each other. And actually, I think when she sees Christians involved in this area, it will change her perception. It will make her realize that we live in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we go to some questions, and we'll take a short break before we take the questions, I sort of wanted to ask you, you've detailed some really big stuff there, some disturbing aspects of our world, and some of the issues that exist also within the church as well. We live in a skeptical age. We live in an age where we're also seeing a number of reasonably high-profile people over the past several years have sort of questioned faith, come to doubt it. There's the growth of the so-called deconstruction, ex-evangelicals. I suppose I wanted to ask you, as someone who has seen, the good, the bad, and the ugly in that sense of our world and the church, what keeps you in the faith? What makes you believe that, no, I still believe this, that I still have faith in God, in Jesus, in the church?
Atheists often ask me that question. I remember one dear atheist, fairly naive atheist actually, trying to tell me all the bad things that had happened, by religious people. And then he stopped. I said, is that all you can come up with? I can give you 5 times more than that. The idea that we're surprised by this usually shocks them, that when they find we're not surprised at all. And that's because the church, like every other institution on earth, recruits from the human race. And we are sinners. I mean, people do things that are wrong. The tragedy is when they don't recognize that they're doing these things that are wrong and they're in the church, and they don't actually take stock of themselves. They don't go back to God. They don't show repentance. They don't ask forgiveness. They don't start the next morning with a new clean slate. Then I think the danger comes. We have to keep a short account with God and constantly be ready to repent and confess our sins and receive his forgiveness, because otherwise we just get deeper and deeper into a mire. And yes, it's tremendously sad when you believe so passionately as I do in redemption and in redemptive hope and in redemptive living and redemptive lifestyles, buying back the wrong and the evil, returning it to God, to see when the church isn't up to the scratch on this. I really do find that. So why am I still a Christian? Because there's nowhere else to go. There is no other truth in the universe that's not grounded in the love of God and his compassion for us, his sacrifice for us, the fact that God is there, and the longing that the human heart has for peace, for goodness, for love, for welcome, for assurance, is a longing that God has put in our human hearts. There isn't anywhere else to go. It is God or nothing. And I don't believe in a meaningless universe where nothing makes sense whatsoever. And when you really get inside the Christian biblical worldview and system, everything makes sense. Sin makes sense. Creation makes sense. But also redemption makes sense too. And it's up to us, as the church, to live it out so people can see it makes sense. And when they see that, their hearts rejoice. They want to see it. They want to see goodness in the world. They don't want to see the mess that we're in. So I think we have a huge undertaking to do. And there is nowhere else to go, and I'm not going anywhere else.
I'm glad to hear it. Can we have a round of applause for Elaine? Thank you. Well, please do take a moment, if you haven't yet, to fill out a question card if you would like to send a question in that way, and we'll begin to gather them up. You can also go onto the app using the QR code on your phone if you'd like to send in your question that way, and I'll have that here on my phone as well. But we'll just take just a couple of minutes break to stretch your legs, put your questions in, and then we'll be back in just a moment with Elaine. Thank you.
Do you think I can get some more water?
Yes, of course. I hope that was enough time to write your question down if you have one. Sam here is just going to start collecting in from the rows any questions that have been written down physically, but I've got lots that have come in on the Slido app as well. So we can begin with some of those, and then perhaps Sam will bring any additional ones over to us. Here's an interesting one to start us off. Elaine, given your early experience with that philosophy professor who tried to knock you off your faith, this person says, would you recommend a philosophy degree to a Christian even after your experience with it?
Oh, boy. Would I recommend it? Yes, I think so. But choose your university carefully. I mean, there are some very good departments where they will give you space. And I mean, up in St Andrews in Scotland would be a good department to go to. Some you should avoid like the plague. I wouldn't go back to Oxford. Although they have a good philosopher in Oxford at the moment. So yeah, it's worth doing. It's very good. A lot of philosophy in the UK is still very linguistic, very logical, full of mathematical symbols and that kind of thing. So you need to find the kind of philosophy that you wanted to study.
I mean, a related question here, given that what you've already said about the way that education comes baked in with assumptions, you know, in terms of what the educators actually, their worldview is. This person asks, is the education system, especially university, dangerous to young Christians and people in general?
Well, I think it's misleading. Here in Cambridge, where we are, we've just, the last year and a half, a Christian in the anthropology department, and the anthropology departments are usually the most relativist of all the social sciences, has decided to start a group which engages theology and anthropology. And it's catching, it's taking off. So I think that's really, really helpful. But I think, she's come along to a number of meetings in other colleges, as well as Newnham, to try to get people to understand that academic study is not neutral, that we are bringing presuppositions and assumptions. And you tend to have dominant assumptions that all the subjects are developing at a particular time. So they go through eras, they go through periods in economics, neoclassical economics, and has a set of assumptions, and then you will move on to a different kind of set of assumptions than other economics. And it's whoever is in vogue at the time dominates the orthodoxy of the field of study that you're looking at. So a good thing to do is to look at the way in which those orthodoxies come full circle, and that's an interesting thing to do. So no, I mean, university education is very important because it does help you to think. It's not like it used to be donkeys years ago, and I think it's a lot more pragmatic now and a lot more functional than it used to be. You're not doing the exciting things we used to do. But education is important wherever you are.
Absolutely. This question possibly comes from a skeptic because they're asking, you say this is why I believe in God, but which God? There are, of course, many perceived gods. So I suppose, yes, the question is why the Christian God?
Mm-hmm. I think the answer to that is that if you look at the biblical understanding of who we worship, we're all, in some sense, worshipping. To be human is to be a worshipper. So it's important to know what God you're worshipping if you're not worshipping the Christian God. The biblical word for that is idolatry. And idols used to be things that you made out of wood or stone or great lumps of marble or whatever. And then they became so splendid and people worshipped them. And if you read the prophet Isaiah, he sends that up in a big way. You know, you take a lump of wood, you turn it into an idol, then you put it in the fire. What's all of this about? And so his understanding of the futility of idolatry is writ large. But today we don't worship bits of, well, some of us worship bits of marble when we get new kitchens and stuff like that. But basically, the things that we're worshipping today are very different. I mean, money, sex, and power, of course. Often it's the self. And I think the worship of the self has come into a major phase in where we are now in the second decade of the 21st century. I mean, it's really, really powerful. So it's not whether you believe in God or not believe in God or what God you believe in. From a biblical point of view, you either believe in God or you believe in an idol. You're worshipping God or you're worshipping an idol. You're giving your life to something or somebody or whatever, but you're still there worshipping. And I think that the important thing is to find out whether the God that you're worshipping can take the weight of your life. Because by and large, most of these idols are rubbish, and they can't even begin to take the weight of your life. They'll buckle under, and so will you. You'll buckle with them. So choose your God carefully, is all I can say. And the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, constantly tells people, choose this day whom you're going to serve. Who are you going to serve? Who are you going to give your life to? Who are you going to give your worship to? Make sure it's big enough to stand your life. And what is big enough? The only thing that's big enough in the universe is love, sacrificial love that reaches out and blesses and wants the good out of people rather than destruction and harm and warfare and so on. So I think that's the thing. Why do I choose this God? Because of everything that's disclosed about this God in the biblical narrative, in the revelation of God in the Scriptures, in the person of Jesus Christ, most of all. If you just look at the gospel accounts of Jesus, what he did, how he lived, and everything that he taught, then you'd have to have a very, very good reason for not wanting this to be your focus of worship.
Thank you so much. One that's come in on a piece of paper here says, as a sociologist, do you have an insight into the decline in church attendance we're seeing, especially among 13 to 20-year-olds, that younger end?
Yes, I do indeed. I mean, one immediate answer is all institutions are declining in their membership. Any kind of institution that you go to, pubs are closing everywhere in the country. There are not nearly many people joining up to things. We're not joiners anymore. We're samplers. We'll try something and then lose interest. We're not people who are committed. So churches used to require commitment from its members. So did lots and lots of other organisations. So the whole idea of entering something for which you have to be committed is not part of where we are in our lifestyle today, and certainly not where the young are. That's number one. Let's try it and see. Let's have a go. Let's keep my options open. And of course, it's the same not just with the church, but it's the same with relationships. With friendships, with marriage, with friendships with benefits, with cohabitation and so on. It's a kind of, let's try it and see. If it doesn't suit me, I'll move on and do something else. That's the ethos that we live in. But the next point is the whole advent of social media and what that's doing to people's lives. The way in which we're connected with people all over the globe through social media, whether we met them or not, whether we know them or not. The options it gives us as to our own identity. I can be 20 people on social media. I can assume an identity, and many people do. I can live out an alternative reality with a whole range of options and so on. And so I think the context and the cultural context in which we live, where and where youngsters, particularly in that age group, are far more interested in their cell phones, their mobiles, and their kind of media presence and media identity than getting together and ever hearing anybody preach. I mean, for goodness sake, come on. And the other thing, the final thing is just the language. That the church has become a very, very archaic institution to people whose languages is very, very different. If you listen to a bunch of 13 to 15-year-olds talking, I don't even know what language they're talking most of the time. And because most of them are not talking anyway, they're texting. And if you look at the contents of the average 15-year-old text, it's gobbledygook. So the culture has moved so far away from all the moorings and trappings that we've assumed to be central to the way that we worship in churches, that it's very, very difficult to reach out to that generation there. We need specialized people to do it. We need people who know that generation, who understand the culture, are right inside it just to get there in the middle with them and then win them back. And it will be a different kind of church they come to. But they are still coming to church, just in a different kind of way.
Yes, I was going to say, I mean, having given that overview, really helpful overview of the reasons why we're not seeing that age group turning up for church. I mean, is it that the church will just have to change in some way to see that age group come back at some point?
The church is good at being all things to all people. I mean, that's what we're always supposed to do. And so the church can have many different kinds of forms, depending on the culture of its adherents. I mean, we don't think twice about having churches that are full of immigrants talking a different language. Of course they do. I mean, why should we expect them to understand English? If they're asylum seekers and they've come from Iran or somewhere, let's have it interpreted. So why would we expect 13 to 20-year-olds to be able to come and not have it all interpreted? So I think that we have alternative forms of church and worship, which is enculturated, which is cited in the culture of the people that are there. I think it's very important that we do that. I'm sure that we could have fantastic churches for that particular age group. Incidentally, we very soon get out of date. We went to a church not long ago in Cambridge, which prized itself really as being a youth church. But when we looked at it, by youth they meant 35-year-olds. And they had the kind of worship and the kind of bands that those people would have loved when they were teenagers. But there were no teenagers there because they thought this was really weird kind of worship. And they thought it was themselves a very kinky, new kind of dynamic church. But actually they were for the 35-year-olds, but not for the younger age group.
Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it? We can sometimes fool ourselves into thinking we're so hip and with it, and we're actually missing a generation. Some really interesting questions here. Perhaps lots to choose from. Well, let's talk about some issues around feminism, because a few people want to ask questions on that front. One person asks, how would you argue for feminist values to those who hold more traditional values within the church?
Feminist values are very traditional. They are that women are human beings too, that women have talents and skills and gifts which need to be used, that there ought to be mutual respect between women and men, and that there shouldn't be violation, rape and disorder. I mean, I think those are fairly traditional values. When we talk about feminism, most of us don't usually know what we're talking about. It's a great spectrum. It's an umbrella term. And underneath that umbrella, there's so many different things that one would call feminists. So, and I do this in earlier books I've written, and in these Scars Across Humanity, I spend a lot of time at the end of that book explaining a lot more about feminism today. Traditional values, what are traditional values? By that, I think I would, if I was talking about traditional Christian values, I would highlight things like faithfulness in marriage, mutual respect in marriage, care for the family and children, respect for the immaturity of children and helping them to grow into maturity, neighbour respect for people who live around you, wanting and treating human beings, adult human beings, with respect, being respectful towards men if you're a woman, being respectful towards women if you're a man. Those for me are traditional values. Then traditional values are not about who does the housework, who does the washing up, who goes to work and earns the money. I think traditionally, of course, we had this concept of the breadwinner, whereas the man went out to work and the woman stayed home with the children. We don't have that anymore, partly because it's very difficult for most families to manage on one salary. It's just a very different kind of culture. And so women often have to work, even if those women who don't want to go out to work find themselves going out to work to make a family wage up, as it were. So what feminism is doing is actually, what it did initially was break free from what they called patriarchy, which was male dominance in society, where men were always the ones who ran everything. I mean, you get politicians were full of men, politics was full of men, business, economics, everything you looked at was male dominant. And they said, our voices must be heard too. And that's what early feminism was doing, trying to get women's voices heard in the echelons of power so that you had a different voice. You had women's views represented in these areas rather than everything being seen through male eyes, which really is a very important thing to do, whichever society you have. What feminism has never wanted to do is turn women into men, so that you're wanting to male values become female values. And when that's happened, when they have done that, you've actually got a very bad society. So when women start to become very competitive or belligerent or strident or angry or whatever, that's not feminism. Believe me, it's the opposite. Today's feminists are a very, very interesting bunch. They actually split down the middle. You've got this thing called the LGBTQI, etc., 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 which is supposed to be an alliance of all of the sexual groups that are not heterosexual. In fact, it's not. And the L's, the lesbians, are splitting away from the LGBTQI and so on. Why? Because they no longer want to go along with the kinds of things that the LGBT or the GBTQ people believe in. So bear with me for a minute. I know these people. I work with them occasionally, and I read them a lot. So you get the radical feminists now have turned a full circle. And whereas, say, in the 1970s and 80s, they were saying, we've got to get away from the constraints of biology and dreaming up crazy ideas as to when a man's bowel could be turned into a kind of womb and men could have children so that women could be free from childbearing, all that's gone. Now they believe in biology. They believe that there's something about maleness and femaleness, anatomy, chromosomes, testosterone, and all of the things that go up to make our bodies that is definitive about who we are. And so you find the radical feminists are very anti the whole idea of, for example, transgender moving into deciding that we have a right to choose which gender we are. There's a great campaign to say that we will not accept the fact that a man with a beard and a penis is a woman. And that's feminism today. So it's not where you think it is. The other thing about these feminists is that they are very, very anti the early liberal feminists who, in the whole area of prostitution, for example, said what we need is to allow the prostitutes to do what they like with their own bodies, but we must make sure that they get proper conditions. So we'll have contracts, we'll have payments, proper payments, and we'll have registers as prostitutes and so on, so that we can keep the profession going along kind of regulated lines. They say, no, it's not a profession. Prostitution is not a profession, it's an oppression. And the best thing we can do for prostitutes is get them out of it. And they actually work, you'll find they're working, radical feminists and evangelical Christians in certain areas to try and get women out of prostitution. So there's layers and layers where feminism has changed a great deal. And you can find that you're on the same side in a whole range of things. There are differences too, and they continue, but we have to understand the whole idea that feminists are against traditional values it really needs an awful lot of unpacking. What are traditional values? What are they for? And I think you'll find that they're for something very similar.
Really interesting answer. I mean, one person asks, where next for feminism? I think you've sort of sketched that out, interestingly, the way that things have moved as the culture has moved. Feminist concerns have sort of moved likewise in these biological terms. But this person also wants to know, where has it gone too far? I mean, you describe feminism as a large spectrum, an umbrella of many different perspectives. I assume there are some perspectives that are labelled feminist where you say, no, I can't go with that. I don't know, I mean, thinking back to the sort of third wave feminists who perhaps said we need to dismantle marriage, because it's a fundamentally patriarchal institution and that sort of thing. Are there sort of aspects of feminism that you say, no, as a Christian, I don't see that as being within line?
I think there are aspects of feminism that I disagree with my fellow sister feminists. The earliest feminist movement I could never have joined, the society, it's called SCUM, S-C-U-M, was the Society for Cutting Up Men. Now, I would never...
I'm glad to hear that.
That kind of thing I would always say no to, because my kind of feminism sees women and men in partnership. We are the body of Christ, but also as women and men, we're both two halves of humankind. And therefore, we owe it to one another to be in partnership. We work together. And I think I recognize and understand how many women feel that they have to work on their own for their rights because they're not going to get them any other way. That's not my experience. My experience is that we move forward in a godly and good way, and that a godly and good way is always a good way for women when we work together as women and men for the dignity of both women and men. I think that's really, really important. So I'm not interested in the kind of feminism that's completely separatist. When I worked for the Open University, which I did for many years, and I taught feminist studies in the Open University, and we have feminist summer schools, and it was all women's team, and we had men sign up for these sometimes, for these summer schools out of interest. I was the only woman on the team who would have men in her group, and all the men came to my group. We were swamped with men in our group, and it was great. And then I found that more and more women wanted to come into the group because they really liked the fact that the men were being included and there was this kind of dialogue. I think it's much healthier that way. So that's the kind of feminism I wouldn't want to touch. I always argue with feminists about abortion. I think we can kind of make it too big a plank of the Christian faith, and that we're more interested in what happens before birth than caring for people after birth. I mean, I think that's a big issue that we really need to face. But I still think that there is something fundamentally about the need to respect life at all cases, and that includes in the womb. So I could never move on there, and that's why many of the radical feminists can't cope with me, because they say I'm not willing to stand with them on women's reproductive rights. Frankly, I don't know what reproductive rights are. It doesn't make any sense to me. So issues like that, I can understand where they're coming from. I respect their position, but I'm not with them on that. And then, of course, on the whole area of who may marry who and how we choose our gender identity. I'm only with the radical feminists on that. I'm not with the liberal feminists who say it's my choice as to whether I'm a woman or a man.
I mean, you're kind of opening up some pretty hot button issues here yourself, so I might as well ask some of the questions that are on those lines that have come in. These are quite popular on the Slido app. So, well, I'll lump these two together. One person asks, the Church of England has struggled for 40 years to agree about blessing homosexual union. Do you see this ever being resolved? Another simply asks, do you have any comments on the Church and the LGBT community?
Yes, this is a very hard one. I was on the General Synod of the Church of England for 28 years, till they let me off for good behaviour. And I was on, I've chosen many of the bishops of the country because I was on the Crown Nominations Commission. I was also on the Living in Love and Faith working party, that I was the only lay theologian on the party that produced the initial report. We were pleased with the report. If you read the report, which I'm sure none of you has done because it's very thick and fat, it's actually a very orthodox account of human sexuality, of human personal identity, of marriage and everything. That's not to say we were all of one mind when we wrote the report. We weren't, but we actually worked together in an amicable and loving and caring way and had a lot of respect for each other. Where it's gone since then has been all over the place. I think bishops have broken ranks with other bishops and decided that they're coming out in public to make demands on the whole area of same-sex marriage and so on. It's a hotbed because when you look at the Church's ordinances, it's very clear what our doctrine of marriage is. My fundamental disagreement with where the church is going at the moment and what it's doing, I have to confess, is this. It's that we are saying one thing and then we're doing something else. And if we were to say, yes, we are moving ahead in order to bless same-sex unions and have same-sex marriages in church, that will be fine. Then we can discuss that. We can take votes on it in General Synod. We can look at all the papers. We can agonize over it theologically, and we can come to a position. Most people, there will be many people disagree with whatever position we come to, but we can do it that way. We're not doing that. What we're saying is, we are not changing the doctrine of marriage. The doctrine of marriage stays as it is. But we are changing the doctrine of marriage, because all the papers that are coming out, all the issues that we're doing, if we're moving into blessing same-sex marriages, we're changing the doctrine of marriage. So we can't have it both ways. And I think that we've got to be straight and honest in what we're doing in order to measure it, weigh it, and then make a vote on it. On the whole issue of same-sex and same-sex attraction and so on, I confess, I really don't know where I am on this. I have many, many friends who are gay men, mostly gay men, but lots and lots of lesbian women, who see themselves as created this way by God and actually feel that they are living authentic, godly lives in a soul partnership with someone to whom they're completely and utterly committed. And they are pledging their troth, and it's a lifelong relationship. I think on a spectrum of sexual relationships, that's probably better than a relationship where you've got adultery and serial monogamy and a whole range of other things. But it's not the biblical option that we're offered. The biblical option is celibacy or marriage between a man and a woman. That's the biblical option. Where else we go is all over the place, but I think some things are better than others. And therefore, the whole idea of condemning every form of relationship, we miss the point, because there are many faithful gay people who are struggling with this issue. Many of my friends, of course, are living in the living out community, where they have made a decision that they are staying celibate because they don't feel that they can ever marry someone of the opposite sex. It costs a lot to do that. It costs a great deal, and that has to be honoured too. But there are those who can't feel that and haven't felt that and have moved into a different position. How we all stay in the same church, I don't know. That's a big issue. But I think what we have to do is to do it honestly, openly, not pretend that we're not changing any of our doctrines. We're still the same as we always are, but actually changing them by default, by practice, even if that's not what we're saying we're doing. We've got to be straight.
Wow, thank you. And I appreciate your own honesty in that, as you sort of see the complexity of life as it presents itself, but obviously the awareness of what the biblical witness is there as well. Perhaps just one question to finish this off, Elaine. And I'm going to slightly tweak this question, because the question itself is, how do you feel Western civilization will evolve over the remainder of this century? That's quite a big question, isn't it? And what will the pressure points be? I suppose my question to add to that is, as you look ahead, predict what the big issues are coming down the road. How can the church, how can Christians be ready to engage and to do what I see you have been doing through your whole life, to look at everything that comes your way through that Christian worldview, through that lens of Christ? So what are some of those issues you anticipate will be next, and how do we ready ourselves to engage them with the grace of Christ?
I think the big issues globally are political issues, economic issues, and issues of peace and war. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the world at the moment, the rise of nationalism, the oligarchs ruling so many areas of the country, the loss of truth. I think that we do live in a post-truth era. And that's why I mentioned this in terms of what the Church of England is doing. If we move into that post-truth and do the same as everybody else in the culture, I mean, we've had it, we've lost it. So truth is a really short supply. We hold it at a premium. People are saying things that are not true, and they aren't believing them. I mean, and I think it's not just Trump and America and all of that. It's manifest in so many areas. And then the whole issue of war, I think that we really do have to do something. Alan's been campaigning for years to try to get people serious about banning weapons and moving towards some form of global disarmament. I think it has to be done before the world kills itself and blows itself up. The lack of peace, even as president of Tier Fund, I just saw the level of unrest growing and growing and growing across the world all the time. So I think we're, and the other thing, politically, of course, the West is going to lose it quite soon. We've been dominant for centuries now. We've had the weapons, we've had the kind of manufacturing base and so on. We've had the academics, and we've had the cannabis, and we've had the business people and so on. But actually that's shifting, and it's been shifting for quite a while. And it's shifting most of all in the way in which the West is now seen by emerging economies and global economies. I've been a member of something called the Emerging Economies Symposia from Oxford University for some years, and we've been monitoring this, the way in which the focus of power is shifting towards the East and shifting towards those new economies that are coming up that are actually fed up to the back teeth of the West. And we don't realize how much respect we're losing globally and how fast this is going. And if they elect Trump in the next election, I mean, it will be gone almost completely. So there's an issue globally as to where the whole world is going. Where the UK is going, heaven only knows. I mean, I really think we're in such a mess right now that we need the church, we need Christians to stand up and make sense, but also speak into the morass, speak into the loneliness of people's lives, speak into the isolation, speak into the poverty, speak into people's struggles with identity and with all the things that are going on around us, and speak truth. We need people in those positions of authority so that their voices can be heard and we can support them and pray for them and get people reading scriptures again. So I think we're in a real dilemma, a predicament, and I fear for my grandchildren's generation because I'm not sure what the country has to offer them, what the world has to offer them.
My only hope and prayer, I suppose, in the midst of that rather gloomy prognosis is these are sometimes the conditions under which God can work. Yes,
and there is one thing that I hold on to, that it's very interesting when an atrocity happens, you know, when somebody comes along and people are gassed, and you know who's done it, and they say, no, it wasn't us. We didn't do it. It must have been them or them, it wasn't us. We're not the ones to blame, and they are the ones to blame. That's still hopeful, because if they say, oh no, it's perfectly all right to murder these people and to gas them, then we've lost it. As long as we hold on to the reality that actually human beings are worthy of respect and dignity, and some things are right and some things are wrong, and murder and atrocities and violence and rape and butchery and bombings and all of these things are wrong. As long as we hold on to that, rather than say, oh yes, but we didn't do them, it wasn't our fault, it was their fault. The moment you say it wasn't us, it was them, you're still accepting that these are wrong. These things are wrong, they should not happen. That's a humanity still holding on to itself. The moment we lose that, the moment we say it's perfectly all right to annihilate other people, to rape other people, to do them to the ground, to force the poor into the bottomless pit. The moment we do that, we've finished as a human race. We're nowhere near there yet. I think at the moment we're going on an ascendancy in the other direction. We're holding on to our humanity, and it's really worth holding on to. And then when we do that, then God blesses us. Then we do that, we're more ready to reach out to what is good and what is wholesome and what is true, and more likely to meet Jesus.
Thank you. Yeah, a round of applause for Elaine. Thank you. Wow. We've covered such a lot of ground with you, Elaine, over the last hour and a bit. Thank you so much for all your answers, your wisdom, the experience, and who you are, and the fact that you're still out there, you know, bringing these words of wisdom and your thoughts and everything you do to such an audience that needs to hear it. So thank you again for being with us. Thank you for coming this evening. If you're around, Elaine and I will both be around for a little longer to meet and talk. But just a reminder that you would be most welcome to the next edition of Why I Am a Christian, and that's with Joe Boot at the end of March. But for now, thank you very much. Safe journeys home. God bless. Thank you.
Oh, I should mention we bought a few books.
Oh, yes, thank you.
In the back there, and I think Alan will be standing there.
They're available just at the exit, are they?
Somewhere out there, yeah.
Do make sure to check out the books as well. Thank you very much, Elaine. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for being so accommodating.
Thank you. God bless you.
Right. I probably was far too kind of far too honest over there.
Oh no.